Hello, 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 everybody. Um, I'm going to go over the chapter six discussion forum as well as chapter six lecture. So let me share my screen really quickly so that I could go to the slides first. And then after we go over the slides, then we'll go over the chapter six discussion. So chapter six is on memory. There's a lot of different parts to memory, but I tried to truncate this as usual just to pertain specifically to the things that would relate to the chapter six discussion forum. All right, so let's dive in. So first things first, memory in and of itself, it involves us storing and retrieving information throughout our lives. So from the moment that we're born, we start to form these memories, and then the memories build upon each other. The memories change, memories erode, memories become stronger, and they happen all throughout our lives. And whenever we need to recall information, like for instance for a test, or if somebody asks us a question, our memory is what helps us to do that. So there's three key functions of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Long story short, encoding is getting information into your mind, storage is keeping it in your mind, and retrieval is bringing it back when you need it. So input, storage, and output. Essentially, there's a bunch of different ways you can say this, but getting information into your memory, keeping it there, and bringing it back. All right. So not only are there different memory processes or stages or parts of memory, there are also different types of memory that exist. So the very first type of memory is actually not on the slides. It's sensory memory. So sensory memory comes from your five senses. So you actually have a memory attached to each one of your five senses. So when you see something, you have a memory that helps you to remember what you saw. It's also called iconic memory. So seeing things is also known as iconic memory. Echoic memory has to do with hearing, and it's when you remember things that you hear. You also have a memory for smell, you have a memory for taste, and you have a memory for touch. So you literally have memories stored for every one of your five senses. Sensory memory is also the fastest form of memory. It usually updates every half a second to couple seconds. So you are literally constantly taking in new information at all times of the day. So all your five senses are taking in new information all the time. Next, we're going to segue to short-term memory, which is what you see on the slide here. So short-term memory is a step above the sensory memory. So sensory memory can last from like a fraction of a second to a couple seconds, but short-term memory can last about 15 to 30 seconds, depending on who you're asking. Um, Short-term memory is holds more information. So sensory memory can only hold certain fragments over time, but short-term memory can actually hold more information, but it's still not a whole lot of information that it can hold. Some researchers would argue that you can hold as many as seven things or nine things in your short-term memory, and you can hold them for about a good 20 to 30 seconds, while others would argue that you can really hold only four to five things in your memory. And then some would even argue that you could really only hold a good three things in your memory. And I think it really largely depends on what it is that you're trying to remember. It also not only does it depend on what it is you're trying to remember, it also would heavily depend on how much you understand whatever it is that you're trying to take in. Like for instance, let's say you're taking one class and you have experience in this class. This is really just adding to your knowledge that you already have. That class, you're probably going to retain a whole lot more of that information and be able to commit a lot more of that information to memory in a much easier way than if you're taking a class in something that is absolutely completely foreign to you. You have no idea what the heck is going on. So the class where you have absolutely no idea what the heck is going on, and then if that class happens to be difficult on top of that, that class is going to be a lot harder to retain information. You're going to have to do a lot more work to keep that information in your memory for that. So, but nevertheless, short-term memory, it lasts 15 to 30 seconds. And it can hold a good amount of information, but it can only hold it for that 15 to 30 seconds. In order for it to go beyond that 15 to 30 seconds, you have to engage in something called working memory. So, working memory is a form of short term memory where you actually are actively processing information. So, for example, if somebody gives you their phone number and you don't have your cell phone right there in front of you to take down the number and put it in your contacts, let's say that you're trying to remember it and you're just saying the number over and over and over again until you get to a phone to be able to save it or whatever. If that were to happen, then you are using your working memory. Another example would be like, let's say that you're taking your regular route to work or to school or wherever you go, and you see that there's a detour. You don't have a GPS, but you kind of know the way that you're supposed to be going. Your working memory will help you figure out, okay, if I cut down this street and then I take that other street, then I'll get back to where I need to go. So that's another example of working memory. So anything that we're actively processing becomes part of our working memory. If we are using our working memory for something, it also makes it easier because we're actively processing it. It makes it easier for us to hold that information in what's known as our long term memory. So, long term memory is memory for things that we remember beyond 30 seconds. So, anything that you remember beyond 30 seconds is considered to be part of your long term memory. It is considered to be supposedly held within you for life, essentially. So, long term memory is for life. Sensory memory, couple seconds, it's gone. Short-term memory, about 30 seconds, it's gone. But long-term memory, as long as there's no brain injury or anything, you're gonna pretty much have long-term memories forever. Because long-term memory is so complex and it holds literally every form of memory that we have in our lives, it has a bunch of different subtypes within it. So we got implicit versus explicit memories. Implicit memories have to do with stuff that we learn without even really necessarily realizing that we're learning it. Like for instance, riding a bike, things like that. So we might have consciously learned how to ride a bike, but once we learn how to ride the bike, we don't have to think about it. We just jump on the bike, get in and start moving. Walking, that's another thing. When we first learned to walk, we had to consciously learn how to put our steps and how to balance and all that other good stuff. But now we can just get up and walk. We don't even have to think about it. We can't even describe how to walk now because it's so embedded within us. So anything that we have the ability to just do without really thinking, that is part of our implicit memory. Explicit memories, on the other hand, are memories that we consciously recall. So, for example, if somebody says, "What is your last name?" and you tell them your last name, that is an explicit memory. You're giving them something that you consciously recall. If somebody says, "What is 2 plus 2?" and you know the answer to that question, that is also an explicit memory. So the list goes on and on. So implicit, explicit, implicit is things that you don't necessarily you know them and you clearly remember them because you engage in them in everyday life, but you may not necessarily know how to describe how you know this thing. Explicit memory is the exact opposite. You are able to consciously recall, consciously describe, et cetera, et cetera. So what about when other people help each other remember? Is it better to remember as a group? Is it better to remember by yourself? Studies have had kind of interesting results. So one thing that they found is that if we all got together in a group and try to remember something, we'll probably remember a lot more than if we try to just remember on our own. But on the flip side, if you get one group of people that remember stuff as a group and another group of people who just remember stuff individually without talking to each other, the ones who remember individually without talking to each other will collectively remember more than the people who remember in a group. So I just thought that that was really interesting, just to point that out. But overall, collaborative memories actually help us learn more. All right, so now we're going to go into what's known as memory failures or the seven sins of memory. And they're called sins because they're things that mess us up when it comes to memory. So things that cause us to not be able to remember for whatever reason. So, first things first is transience. So, transience has to do with forgetting something because time has passed. So, for example, if I ask you, what did you wear on your first day of preschool? Unless you have a picture of what you wore that day, you probably don't remember what you wore that day because so much time has passed. But if I asked you as a 4-year-old, what did you wear on your first day of preschool? They'll say, oh, yeah, I wore my dinosaur shirt or whatever. So you'll know exactly what you wore. You know exactly what you did, et cetera, et cetera. The closer you are to something in time, the easier it is to remember. But the further you are from something in time, the harder it is to remember all the details. Some things are very significant and you're able to remember more details than others. But most things, if they're not like a really significant thing in your life, you're not gonna remember what you wore or what you ate for lunch your first day of preschool. You're not gonna remember those things because time has too much time has passed. Then we will take a little pause here and we'll go into forgetting. So forgetting, why do we forget? How do we forget? What's going on with this? So a little bit of background on this. A man named Herman Ebbinghaus was the researcher who kind of opened up the door to study forgetting. And the way that he did this was he had actually earned his PhD in memory. And once he got his PhD, he was ready to roll. But unfortunately, he could not find a job. So he's like, I don't want this PhD to go to waste. So let me find a way to still use the skills that I just spent all these years learning. So he's like, I don't have a laboratory, I don't have a job, but I do have myself, and I do know how to study memory. So what he did was he used himself as a test subject. And what he did was he created something called nonsense syllables. So he would just throw a bunch of different three-letter words together that weren't actually words. Like for instance, WIB. That's not a word. But he would put that along with a whole bunch of other nonsense syllables and he would memorize them. So he would have like hundreds of them that he would sit there and memorize. Once he memorized the entire list, he tested himself on the list and then he kept testing himself over time. Unfortunately, what he found was that the very first time he tested himself, he got 100%. But about 20 to 30 minutes later, he had already dropped to like 40%, or dropped to 60% that he remembered. And after an hour, he'd only remembered 50%. So our memory declines pretty rapidly, very quickly, is what he gathered from that. And but one other interesting thing that he found, even though we do tend to forget most of the stuff that we learn within the first hour, one good thing is that once we do reach that threshold of things that we kind of retain, that pretty much remains stable over time. So when he tested himself, he found that he forgot about 40 to 50% of the stuff that he learned, but once that to 50% was gone, he still retained that other 50% for months and months and months later on. So our memories are kind of bad, but they're also kind of cool and kind of interesting and kind of good. All right, so back to our seven sins of memory. So, next sin of memory is absent mindedness. So, absent mindedness is exactly how it sounds. We're just not paying attention. So, for example, have you ever walked out the door but realized you forgot your keys? That would be an example of absent mindedness. Or you go into the kitchen because you know you had to get something out the refrigerator, but then you forget what you were supposed to get out of the refrigerator. Then you had to go all the way back to the other room, and then you remember, then you go back, and then you forget again. So, if that has ever happened to you, absent mindedness is the culprit behind that. So absent-mindedness. Then we got blocking. Everybody experiences this one all the time. But blocking is when you know the answer to something and it's like right there, but you like cannot get the words out for whatever reason. So if somebody says, "Oh, who was the guy who played Ghost in the show Power?" And you're like, "Oh man, I could see him in my head. I know his name was Ghost, and then he had Tommy as his partner, and then Tariq was his son, and then Tasha was his wife, and and all this stuff in the show, but you forget the guy's name. You can see his face in your head and all that, but it's just not coming to you. Most people deal with this on a regular basis. And usually for most people, within about an hour or so, you'll actually get the memory and it'll actually finally come to you. But it could be a little bit frustrating in those first initial moments where you're like, oh, I know this thing, but I just cannot bring it to the mind. So, blocking or tip of the tongue phenomenon is another thing that is called. All right. So then we got memory misattribution. So memory misattribution has to do with having a memory and being able to remember it, but forgetting exactly where you remembered it from. So let's say that you like to watch Grey's Anatomy and you're also taking this class. And Grey's Anatomy, I've never actually watched the show, unfortunately. Don't tell nobody about that. But from what I understand, they talk about a lot of like psychological stuff on the show. So let's say that you actually learned something really cool on Grey's Anatomy, but then you also learned that similar thing in this class. Because they're so interchangeable in many ways, you might forget which one you learned the information from. So you might say, "Oh, I learned in my psychology class about the seven sins of memory." But let's say that we never talked about the seven sins of memory in this class, but you did hear about it on Grey's Anatomy. It's very easy to misapply where you actually learned the information from. So another example would be like if you have a conversation with one of your friends and then you talk to one of your family members and you're like, "Oh, remember I told you XYZ?" And they're like, "You never told me that. What are you talking about?" And then you're like, "Oh, that must have been this person I told that." So that's another example of memory misattribution. All right, so then we got suggestibility. Suggestibility has to do with you remembering something, but your memory is kind of fragile for whatever reason, and other people giving you like biased information that causes your memory to be shaped in the way that their questions are structured, basically. So, for example, let's say that you get into a car accident or something and somebody asks like it's a heat of the moment car accident, you're not expecting this to happen, it happens out of nowhere, and then somebody comes along to ask you like what happened, and you're like, "Oh, did you see the red car?" And you're like, in your mind initially, if they would have never asked that question, you may not have ever even mentioned a red car. But because they said, "Did you see the red car?" That might cause your mind to think, "Okay, there must have been a red car." So then your mind will try to conjure up an image and be like, "Oh, yes, I did see the red car," even though you never saw the red car. So that's an example of suggestibility. Somebody gives you information which could be biased, and because it's kind of in the heat of the moment, it causes you to remember something in a way that it wasn't necessarily what happened. So, suggestibility. Next one leads directly into this. This is bias, but this one is not necessarily from an outside source. So suggestibility is when somebody else's biases color our memories, but regular memory bias is when we have our own biases, and that's what discolors our memories. So, for example, let's say that we've always hated math. Let's just say we always hated math. We go into a math class, we got to take it. It's required for our major. We don't want to take this class. We ain't never liked no math class that we've ever taken. If we take that class, even if the class is a really good class, by the end of it, we might still in our mind think that the class have a more negative perception of that class and a more negative perception of the professor of that class because of the fact that we never liked math. On the flip side, if we always love math and we go through the class and the class wasn't even really that great because we love math so much, we might have more positive memories of that class because of the fact that we already like the subject. So having some type of bias for or against a certain thing can cause our memories to be influenced in a positive or negative direction. And then last but not least, persistence. So this one is the only one that doesn't cause us to forget anything. It actually makes us remember something that we want to forget. So all the other ones we're forgetting stuff for whatever reason. This one we're remembering stuff and we don't want to remember that thing. So a prime example of this would be like something that embarrassing that happens to us. Like for example, let's say that we're walking and we're walking right in front of somebody that we have a crush on and then we trip and fall flat on our face. Oh, why would we want that to happen? Nobody wants to deal with that. Nobody wants to experience that. Nobody wants to relive that. We're like, let's gloss over that. That never happened. But of course, since your mind is embarrassed, it's going to keep replaying that incident over and over and over. Oh, they saw me. They laughed at me. This happened. This happened. So that memory is going to keep going over and over and over again in your mind. And you want to get rid of it, but it just refuses to go away for whatever reason. So persistence is the final one. So that is the end of the slides. And let's go over to the forum so we can actually talk about what the forum was about. So, chapter 6 discussion forum. It says, using the concepts you learned in chapter 6, think of a significant memory from any point in your past that you shared with at least one other person. Write down everything you remember about the memory, then interview that person and ask them to tell you everything they remember about the memory. What are the similarities in what you remember and what are the differences? The reason why I'm asking this is because of the fact that not only do all the things that we talked about, like the seven sins and all that, not only do all those things contribute to our memories or us forgetting things, our own individual perceptions and experiences of the world are different from other people. So if you interview one another person about the exact same thing, even if you were both part of it, you were both there from beginning to end, you're going to find that there will probably be some things that they remember that you don't, or things that they highlight that you don't, or vice versa. Even if you kind of do remember mostly the same things, there will usually be some kind of detail that they will draw more of than you do. So this, I figured this would be a fun way to kind of do like a capstone of this chapter. Um, as a part to this, if you can also include what do you think contributed to the similarities and differences between your memories, like what from the chapter? So was it transience? Was it suggestibility? What do you think it was that contributed to the similarities or the differences between the memories of you and this other person that you shared the memory with? That would be another cool thing to kind of tie in what we learned in this chapter. All right. So that is the end of this this explanation. So hopefully everybody has a delightful, marvelous, outstanding week. And I'm back again with another lecture soon.